I want to first of all welcome you all to Temple Israel and to what I know is going to be a really interesting talk and discussion. I really want to thank you all for coming. I don't know how many of you saw there was a great article in yesterday's Reporter about about Michael's book, and it did mention this. I don't know how many of you saw that. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our own Michael Hoberman, who is a member of our synagogue, whose children his son had a bar mitzvah just last year, his daughter was bat mitzvah a couple of years ago. And I remember when Michael gave an initial presentation about this book that he was starting to write, where he was interviewing Jews from rural New England, and lo and behold, he has written what I think is a really interesting, just very comprehensive, wonderful book about the cultural life of Jews in small-town New England, called How Strange It Seems. Michael is an associate professor of English and folklore at Fitchburg State College. And as I said, he's been a member of Temple Israel for a number of years. And he has copies of the book if you would like to buy one afterwards, or if you already have one, he'd be happy to sign it. So Michael is going to be speaking about the book. He'll take some questions, and without further ado, I want to turn things over to Michael.
Thank you, Janice.
Thank you so much, Michael.
So yeah, I remember pretty well, Janice, doing a talk maybe 3-4 years ago when I was in the middle of doing all the interviews for the book, and it's nice to have it done, and the beautiful cover. I should point out the cover is perfect, and you should know that this gorgeous quilt that's depicted on the cover is actually was made by a Jewish women's group in Idaho. And I was pretty intrigued by that, and I figured all of the Jewish women in Idaho contributed. And for all I know, that's probably the case. Let me say a little bit about. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I conceptualized it and how I did the research and how I ended up writing it. I want to share some of the highlights, and maybe I'll read some of my favorite stories, although it's very difficult to choose my favorite stories. And the only part of the book that I'll really be reading is towards the end of my part. I want to read just a little bit of my conclusion to you. The first thing I would do, though, is to try to explain the title. And there's a history for the title. If you read the article in the Recorder, then you know why it's called what it's called. But essentially, when I first started doing research for this, I saw that James Henry Wadsworth Longfellow had written this poem on the Jewish cemetery in Newport. And it's the first line of the poem is "How strange it seems," and the poem is very long, and it's very, in its own kind of 19th century way. It's a very lovely and very philo-Semitic, coming from the descendant of New England Puritans, a very philo-Semitic poem, really admiring these Jews who, as we know, at one time were a mainstay in colonial Newport. And kind of marveling over the fact, boy, how weird it is. What were these people doing here? Why are we looking at Hebrew inscriptions on tombstones in Rhode Island in 1852? And what happened to those people? They're all gone. That's where Longfellow was coming from. So it seemed like a good title because, in fact, we know that they're not all gone at all. Maybe those exact people are gone, but so many generations of Jewish people have lived not just in New England, but in smaller towns in New England, going back to really 1649. That's when the first Jewish person came into New England. Now, you're going to have to forgive me one other thing, and that is that, as you've probably experienced with people who write books, when a book comes out, they're totally done with that book, right? So I'm not interested in this book anymore. I know that's what you came here to hear about. What I'm interested in is the book I'm working on now, which happens to be about those Jews in Newport, Rhode Island, 300 years ago. So every now and then I may wander into talking about that. Right now I'm actually on leave from Fitchburg State. I have a whole year and a fellowship that enables me to just concentrate 100% on researching a book on Jews in colonial New England and connections between Jews and Puritans. And it's proving to be really fascinating, and I realize it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing to be able to actually be told, okay, your job for a year is to write this book and don't do anything else. So anyway, that's very exciting. The poem, the Longfellow poem, comes into it because that was really the starting point for this project. And when I started this out, I was pretty naive and overly ambitious, and I thought, well, I'm going to do a book that just tells the whole story of Jews in New England. And what I realized afterwards is that you can't do that in one book, or at least I couldn't do it in one book. So I ended up doing this first. I kind of basically did the second part of the story first, and now I'm working on the first part of the story. And the second part of the story, which is to say the part of the story that covers about the last 100 years of history, is difficult to do using books. You can't really find a lot of library sources on Jewish life in New England, in the last century. And so that's where the ethnography came in. The other thing is that by training, when I was a graduate student at UMass, I studied folklore and oral history. That's what I did, and my first big research project was an oral history project as well, so it kind of came naturally to me to do the ethnography. Right now I'm struggling not doing ethnography anymore and working in archives, which I've never done before, basically pretending to be a historian for a year, but that's another story. So I figured on doing ethnography, and I figured that I would need to talk to lots of different people, and the only parameters I was defining for myself were essentially Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. I figure you can take the whole state of Maine and call it rural if you want to. The largest city in Maine is Portland, and I think it has well under 100,000 people. Vermont, New Hampshire, the same thing.
Can you explain ethnography to our two young Hebrew school
Yes.
students?
Ethnography is basically when you want to tell the story of people and you find that you can't find a lot of books about ordinary people. So what you do is you go and you find those people yourself and you sit down with them, and very often what people do is they'll get a video recorder or a tape recorder and they'll just ask those people to tell those stories. So what an ethnographer does is to go out and study a group of people by going to their houses and saying, hey, can you tell me about what it was like growing up where you grew up, and tell me about what was school like, and tell me about your jobs that you've had. And that's, yeah. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's great.
So the starting point for me was finding people to interview. I had plenty of personal connections to people through this community and my own immediate friends and so on, but that wasn't going to cast a wide enough net. So what I did, now some of you may remember there used to be, until relatively recently, there was a thing called the Conference on Judaism in Rural New England. It met once a year in northern Vermont, and they had a great email list and a great, sort of a means of communicating electronically. So I posted a note up there, this must have been in about 2002, 2003, and said, I'm writing a book about Jews in rural New England. If you're interested in being interviewed, please write me back. And a half dozen or so people wrote me back and said, sure. And so I knew that was my starting point. I went and found those people. There were some people in northern New Hampshire and a couple people in Maine and so on. I knew that it was going to work because if you start with half a dozen, each of those half dozen people at the end of the interview, I would say, okay, well, who else should I talk to? And those half dozen people each give me 2 or 3 more people. It's not going to take long before I've got more people on my hands than I can possibly handle. And that's essentially what happened. I worked at it for about 3 or 4 years, driving around to these different places. The farthest away I went was a town called Mars Hill, Maine, which is near Presque Isle, Maine, so it's on the Canadian border. It's about as far away from here as you can get and still be in New England. And then there were other people I interviewed who are in this room right now, like Joe and who else? Who is Is there anyone else who's in the book?
Lewis?
No.
No, we figured that out.
Oh.
We figured that. But Joe and other people from this community, Phyllis is in the book. So I went far and I also went near, and I ended up interviewing about 60 individuals over the course of about 50 interviews. Some of the interviews I met with maybe 2 people at a time, like a married couple or something like that. The interviews themselves, I tape recorded, and I had the same bunch of questions that I asked everybody. I wanted to be somewhat consistent with that. So I would start out by saying, can you tell me about your family background? Where are your grandparents from? Where did they, which places in the old country did they come from? How did your family end up here, if that's the case? What kinds of things did your family do for a living, and so on and so forth, right through to questions about people's Jewish observance, and are you part of a synagogue, and what's that like, and what kind of Hebrew education did you have, and so on. So I asked basically the same questions, but I was very willing to improvise. And so and this is something that you have to do, I find, when you do oral history interviewing, is when people say things that are interesting to you, you have to listen carefully, because maybe a good follow-up question is going to come out of that, which is something totally unanticipated. If somebody sounds like they've got something interesting to say about a subject that you might not have anticipated, then it's nice to follow that person down. I like the interview to be as interesting, if not more interesting, for the interviewee than it is for me. I like that person to feel happy and excited to tell me whatever they're telling me about. So there's a certain amount of consistency, but at the same time, flexibility is, I think, I found to be key. In most cases, I interviewed each person once, and that was just owing to time limitations. The interviews were usually averaged about an hour long, but sometimes up to an hour and a half, and maybe some of them a little bit shorter. One of the most onerous tasks involved in doing this kind of research is that you have an interview, it's on audio tape, and if you want to really write about it, you have to have a written transcript. And that takes forever to generate. I don't know if you've ever tried to do that. Take an audio tape. I think there's a formula, even for an efficient typist, it takes something like, I don't know, a couple hours for every 10 minutes of audio. I mean, it's a crazy task, but I was able to get some grant money from the college where I teach, and so I was able to hire people to do that. So that's one area where I had, I'm really grateful for having had that assistance. If otherwise, I'd probably still be transcribing. There wouldn't be a book here. I wouldn't have had time to do it. Yeah.
Did you say when you started the project?
I think I said roughly, I think it was about 2002, 2003. Yeah. And it was all based on the limitations of my, how much time I had for my job to go here or go there or what have you. But I put in about 3 years of just interviewing before I really started to do the writing.
Excuse me.
Yes.
The transcripts, they're verbatim from conversations,
Yeah.
so unedited. So you would have a lot of.
That's right. That's right. That's right. I mean, the people I hired to transcribe, to varying degrees, some of them would, not include the ums and the uhs, and some of them would include every single and and I paid them all uniformly, but or the grant paid them all uniformly. But that's right. You get a lot of stuff. I think I have. I was telling Jane and Ken, who might want to archive this stuff, I have probably 800 pages of single-spaced transcript, which in the book I obviously boiled down to this synthesized piece. But
A lot of vernacular in there, though, too. I picked up just little isms that people would say.
Well, because that's the joy of it, really, is that
Right,
you're
it's
getting
getting
language,
your
and
voice.
it's a natural element.
Did you do any phone interviewing? I thought there were some people from California.
No. There's a woman from California, but I interviewed her while she was visiting her family here. Yeah. And there was one place where I felt like I slightly cheated, but I can tell you, where I think it was it was somebody else who lives in Germany, and somehow or other through a friend of hers who lives in Shelburne Falls, she found out about the project. She sent me an email about her grandfather who had been the rabbi in Great Barrington. And I just I couldn't resist using her little email story in the book. I think I acknowledged it in the book, but otherwise it was all audio. It was all audio. And you know, there's a joy in that for me. You know, I teach English, and I always, you know, whether I'm teaching a literature course or a course in my own areas of interest, specifically, I like to get students to pay attention to the beauty of language. And I think that you can find in a lot of the stories in the book, particularly since they're written on the page there's something literary about them, you know, and I like to hold them up, and I like to have students in my classes think about how, you know, the story that this woman tells about her grandfather and the work he did, there's as much literary beauty to that as there might be in a passage from Huckleberry Finn. You know, and it's no less worthy of being thought of in the same way and interpreted in the same way. You know, in the same way that you're willing as a student to devote hours and hours of time, maybe reluctantly, but you still do it. Your professor wants you to write a paper about a Shakespeare play. Well, why shouldn't we look at the language of ordinary people as if it has the same literary validity? So that's the philosophy behind ethnography. And it's also, the other aspect is that if you want these stories to be told, you have to do it that way. As I said, the books aren't there. One of the more lighthearted anecdotes that comes to mind when I think about writing the book is when I really got started on it initially, just started to have these fleeting thoughts, I went to the library tower at UMass to see what kind of books there were on this subject. And I was using the online catalog, and I saw there was a book somewhere on the 16th floor or something like that about Jewish farmers in New England. And I thought, wow, and I jumped in the elevator and I went up to the 16th floor and I found the book, and the book is like this thin, you know, it's like a 25-page little pamphlet. It was proved to be very useful, but the point is, if you want these stories, you have to find the people. Brattleboro, or I guess Keene, they have a place too, Sam's Outfitters, right? Okay, so Pal Borofsky, who's the owner of that place, he married a woman who was not Jewish, and she converted to Judaism. This is back probably in the 1950s. Another guy who I interviewed way up in northern Maine married a non-Jewish woman, and she converted too. So sometimes that happened earlier on. There are probably not as many cases of that. Some of the stories, let me just go back quickly, the stories of how people ended up here. I have some favorites. So I think my very favorite is the one that was told to me by Milt Adelman, who lives part of the year in Florida, and the other part of the year, he's in his 80s, the other part of the year in this town I mentioned before, Mars Hill, Maine. Okay, so his father came to the United States sometime in the 1880s or 1890s, and had come from someplace in northern Russia, and took the boat and got off in Ellis Island and spent a year in New York City working at a hardware store as a clerk. And he just, according to Milt, his father just couldn't stand New York City. He had come from a really remote part of Russia, and New York City was just much too clamorous and oppressive for him. And so he asked one of his co-workers at the hardware store, how do I get out of this place? And how can I get to a place that is as much like Siberia as any in the United States? And apparently, according to the story, this is the family story, the guy said, well, you know, go to Penn Station or wherever, go to Grand Central, get on the train, and don't get off until the Canadian border. And that's the story of the Adelmans, is that's in fact what this grandfather did. Hiram Adelman took the train to Presque Isle, Maine, got off the train, and started out as a peddler, which is what many people did. So this would have been, I think this is like 1907. Eventually got into growing potatoes and being a potato broker. This section of Maine, Aroostook County, is the most remote part of Maine, right on the New Brunswick border. that's where the main potatoes come from. And at one time in the 20s and 30s, I had come across this idea, actually in that tiny little pamphlet I mentioned to you before, there was some mention of this, but I just couldn't believe it to be true. It said that in the 20s and 30s, many of the potato growers in northern Maine were Jews. Yeah, right, that can't be true. But then I found out from, somebody put me in touch with the Adelmans, they were one of about half a dozen Jewish families who grew potatoes on acres and acres and acres of land, and not only grew them, but also were the brokers of potatoes. So that's one of the livelier stories, which we can either believe or not believe, but it's just a lovely piece of family folklore. Now, to accelerate to a much more current story, some of you may know this person, this guy Shmuel Cemento, right? Real wonderful character. He lives in Longmeadow these days, but he also has property in Reedsboro, Vermont, not far from here. And so when I interviewed him, I asked him, so this is the story, the 1990 story, why did you come here? How did you end up here? And he told me about how he and his wife, now he was an entertainment lawyer. I think he used to represent like the band and people like that in upstate New York and so on. He was really in the money. And his wife is some kind of financial something or other. They had this wonderful life, and they had this big place somewhere out on Long Island. And he was a horse enthusiast, so they had horses. I mean, they were living high on the hog. And well, excuse the term. They were living well, and
that came. Is that up in one of your stories about the people in Connecticut who wanted to get pigs?
Oh, the pig story, right. Well, anyway, they were living very well, and he said one day he was driving home from work, and his car, the car he was in, which was the 7th car within this family fleet of cars, couldn't fit into the driveway because their landscaper was parked here, and their 3 housekeepers were parked here, and this other person was parked there. Too much, and they just basically, the story is they sold it all. They moved to Vermont. They started to make maple syrup. So you can file that story away as true, or you can file it away as a lovely and interesting and compelling story. But so that first section of the book recounts things like that. Another interesting thing that came up in that first part of the book is I asked people when I asked them about grandparents, I wanted to know, as I mentioned before, tell me about the old country, where they came from, and so on. And I also wanted to know, what memories did your grandparents or your parents pass on to you about the old country, about Poland or Lithuania. And to a remarkable degree, people did not really, so we're talking about people who were born in the United States hearing this stuff from parents and grandparents. Those memories were not passed on. I mean, the memories that were passed on were the stories about getting out of Lithuania. Like, we bribed this guy, or we rode in a wagon. There was a story about people riding in a wagon and a bunch of border guards shoving pitchforks into the hay, and almost all that kind of stuff. But there was very little landscape description. If I asked a person, did your father tell you, what was the geography like in this? That stuff wasn't passed on. And I kind of chalked it up, after a while I chalked it up to, sort of a collective act of repression. Like, why would we want to remember these places? These were places where we were not welcome, where we couldn't own land. There's certain cultural richness to the life of the shtetl, but that doesn't mean that you would necessarily be attached to the landscape itself. Only one person in the book actually was born in Europe, and this was a guy who was a retired rabbi in Burlington, Vermont. And he grew up in a shtetl and left there when he was 6 years old, came here at age 6. He had a memory of his town, which was a very chilling memory, and that was that he was playing this game that kids used to play where you roll a hoop down the street, and he was rolling a hoop down the street, and somehow or other, he wasn't paying attention, he was just a little boy, his hoop rolled right into the open doors of the Catholic Church, and it was Easter week. And he got chased out of there, and it was just an awful, awful thing. So you can see why people wouldn't have those kinds of memories, or they might have those memories, but they wouldn't cherish them enough to pass them on to their children and grandchildren. Now, moving away from that into the agriculture story. So I've already mentioned the Adelmans, and the book talks about the potato growers and that. It also talks about not far from here in southwestern Berkshire County, there's a teeny little town called Sandusfield. It's not that far from Great Barrington. Sandusfield at one time had a Jewish, what you call an agricultural colony. All right. In the turn of the century period, there were actually two sort of European movements that were trying to bring Jews back to the land, so to speak. One of them is the one that we call Israel, right? The one resulted in Israel. That's the Zionist movement. And the other movement was a movement to disperse Jewish people throughout primarily the New World into South America and parts of North America on these agricultural colonies. You'd be shocked to hear where some of these places were. There was one in Louisiana, there were ones in Oregon. This is about the 19 teens and that period. There were ones in the Southwest and so on. Very few of these places took, so to speak. Very few of these places lasted more than a few generations. New Jersey is one, right? There were large Jewish agricultural settlements in New Jersey which are still there. The Catskills is another place where Jews ended up farming for a few generations. The most famous of them being, I talked about Woodstock before, Max Yasgur, remember him? Yasgur's farm, that was a Jewish dairy farmer in the Catskills. Anyway, some of these places took, most of them didn't. There was one that was set up in Sandusfield, and it lasted about, maybe they had about a 25 year period. They started out trying to do mixed agriculture. Basically, these were people who were on the Lower East Side, and they were essentially like thrown onto trains and said, okay, go to Berkshire County and raise cows instead. And it didn't work very well. It didn't work very well. Berkshire County soil is probably the poorest soil in Massachusetts. These people didn't have very much agricultural training. The ones of them who made it, who lasted, went into poultry farming. And there's still several families in the Great Barrington area who go back to that agricultural settlement. There's one family that's still, well, you could say they're still farming, and I feature them in the book, and that's the Otis Poultry Farm. Okay, the Pineson brothers have if you ever go into Otis, Massachusetts, you come, I forget which road, I think it's Highway 8 or something like that. For miles before you get there are these big billboards with chickens laying eggs, and Otis Poultry Farm. That poultry farm has been run by a Jewish family for the last 100 years, more than 100 years, and those guys are still there. And that's sort of a remnant of this Sandusfield thing. The people were funded, at least initially, they received loans that came from the Rothschild family. So this was an international movement to try to settle Jews on farms. There are all kinds of stories like that. Now, leaving that older story aside and the story of various poultry farmers and so on, I want to again update it. So there's this quieter period during the middle part of the 20th century. A lot of these the earlier farming families, the pattern was, and this is just sort of a Jewish pattern in America that we all know very well. The family starts out, they have this, quite, successful business. The first thing that happens when the kids are old enough is their parents send them to college, right? Because that's what you do. You go to college. They go to college. Most of them don't come back. Why would you go back to Mars Hill, Maine after you've been at Dartmouth or wherever you went to school? It would make more sense to do something else. There were a few instances like the Pinesons and Otis where they did come back, or one or two came back. But for the most part, a lot of these farms died out, so to speak, because the education, the tendency to want to educate kids created professionals, and professionals didn't want to be tethered to little towns. That's an interesting area where I think the Jewish pattern is different from so many other ethnic groups in small towns in New England, that no matter how connected up to the small town a Jewish family might be, that doesn't mean they're not going to want their kids to go and get an education and move on in life necessarily. Although when Milt Adelman talks about his sons not coming back, he's moved to tears. You know, it was difficult for him. Anyway, the quiet period of the mid-20th century, and then back to this 60s, back to the land revival, that's where there's a lot of new agriculture coming in. And so today, as we know with many, community-supported agriculture projects and so on, well, it happens that not an insignificant number of those projects are run by Jewish people. Now, some of those people are, just haphazardly happen to be Jews who are doing community agriculture, and some are more deliberately. So in the book, I talked to Michael Doctor, who's in Hadley and runs the food bank farm. And while he himself is not in any way religious or observant, when I did the interview with him, he said my son's really devout man, or something like that. Those were his words. And even for him, his cultural connection to Judaism felt important and was something that underlay his desire to do an agricultural project that would better the world around him. There are other people who are doing, I never got to talk to this guy, but I recently ran into him, I think at the Garlic Festival in Orange, a guy who makes pickles, right? So there's another person, and then there's this project, there's some pictures of it in the book, in Connecticut at the Isabella Freedman Center, this farm called Adama, which is run by a bunch of young, recent college graduates from the best I can tell, who studied agriculture and sustainability and stuff like that, and wanted to do an agricultural project that would be rooted in a Judaic way of thinking. And we went there and walked in their fields and saw how, they do the thing where, the edges of the fields, the produce from the edges of the fields is donated to various food kitchens. That's the place where they didn't know what to do with their compost. And they had so much compost from the Freedman Center, from all these huge meals that were served there, that they had a very lengthy halachic debate about whether it would make sense to have pigs come and eat the compost. And I think they ended up doing that. They were also up in the air about whether it was okay to milk their goats on Shabbat. And I asked about that, and the guy said, well, of course we had to milk the goats on Shabbat, but didn't mean that we didn't argue about it for weeks and weeks. There was nobody ever questioned that they were actually going to do it, but it still felt important to discourse about it. All right, now that moves me up into the next section of the book, which is about economic livelihood and so on. So the peddlers are really a huge part of the story. The peddlers and also cattle merchants. I think I actually talked about cattle merchants in the farming chapter. It doesn't matter. As far as economic livelihoods, cattle merchandising and retailing was a huge factor for people, for Jewish families in small towns in New England, going back again to the 1880s, 1890s, and so on. The story with cattle merchants is quite interesting because you can trace that back to Europe. Because in Eastern Europe, although Jews couldn't own land, as I mentioned before, they were quite often involved in agriculture sort of indirectly by being principal cattle merchants and horse merchants. And so that happened here. Many Jewish families in places like Maine and New Hampshire and right here in western Massachusetts made their living selling cattle. And you can't be that involved in selling cattle and not own land and not have your own herd of cattle. So it was a way in which Jews became involved in dairy farming too. The peddlers, many of them, again, and when I refer to people in general, these people could be in Laconia, New Hampshire, they could be in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, they could be in Lewiston, Maine. There are so many communities that supported this kind of thing. The people who were doing peddling started out very often literally carrying the stuff on their backs. All right. The first Jewish peddlers in New England actually came here before all this, in the 1840s and 50s. They were coming in. These were German Jews, right? There was a big peak of German Jewish people coming to the United States in the 1840s after all the tumult in Europe, and several 100,000 Jews came to the United States then. This is before the Civil War. Many of them started out peddling. There's a fascinating diary which was written in German, but it's been translated into English by a guy who was a peddler right here. He talks about Shutesbury, and he talks about all these different towns in about 1849. Abraham Kahn was his name. So there was sort of a long tradition of that. There's also one of my favorite stories by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Ethan Brand, I don't know if you're big on mid-19th century American literature, but that used to be my big thing. And in Ethan Brand, which takes place right at the foot of Mount Greylock, okay, all of a sudden a Jewish peddler shows up and becomes part of this very dramatic, it's sort of a otherworldly, cataclysmic event that happens at the foot of Mount Greylock. But the Jewish peddler is very much a part of it. So we know that there were Jewish peddlers here a long time ago. The people that I end up talking about in the book are more recent people, and these were the people, the Ellis Island people, who decided to go to small towns for whatever reasons and try their luck there, and they started off carrying stuff and stopping at houses and so on. There were a couple cases where I found this really interesting, where Jewish peddlers, this is again relayed to me from their grandchildren, right, would stop in at a house and would be invited in and sort of celebrated and presented with, or asked to read in Hebrew to the assembled Yankee family there, because these New England Yankees were fascinated by the people of the book, the people who could read Hebrew. There were at least a couple stories I heard about that, and that was sort of nice and heartwarming to hear about that. Most of these people either moved on to doing something else fairly quickly, or they ended up settling in and having a retail space. So any number of these towns, well into the 1950s and even into the 1960s, if you went down Main Street in Great Barrington or Bennington, Vermont, many, many, many of the stores were owned by Jewish families. In fact, the majority of Jews who lived in those towns were people who owned stores, furniture stores, clothing stores, dry goods, and so on. One of the more interesting people that I met who talked about that whole story was this guy, Edwin Shertock, who's quite elderly. He's in his late 80s, might be in his early 90s now. He lives in Laconia. He was the mayor of Laconia in the 1970s at one point, and his family owned a big furniture store there. So he had all kinds of stories to tell me about how he learned retailing from his father. His father was a total seat-of-the-pants guy. Edwin Shertock went to college, but his father had, just learned it by doing. And he also told me stories about this one famous Jewish guy in Laconia at the turn of the century who was reputed to live in a house where his chickens and his horses kind of came and went in from the barn into the house, back and forth, kind of reproducing the shtetl in Laconia. So this was sort of an interesting town character in that town. I think we know where this story goes. Eventually these families, many of them make it. If they're still in retailing, they're the exception to the rule. Sam's Outfitters is one of the few examples of a place where you can say this is a Jewish family operated store that's been in business for this long. But for the most part, if people moved out of peddling or retailing, it wasn't because they hadn't done well at it. It was because they had done so well at it that they didn't need to do that anymore. Their kids grew up, their kids went to college, and professionalized. And so the story now is a different story from the story that you would hear 50, 60, 70 years ago. Now, the last section of the book, the last main section of the book, talks about religion. And I guess the big arc of that story is that we start at the turn of the century with Orthodoxy, and we end up with something like what we have at Temple Israel, which is a mishmash of everything. And the way I understand that to work out is fairly simple. Orthodoxy was what people knew. It's all there was. If you were from the shtetl, Judaism was Orthodoxy. That's all there was. You didn't have an alternative. The Reform movement came from German Jews came from a different group of people, came from the Sephardim before the Germans, and the majority of the people in this book are people who go back to that Ellis Island story, that story that begins in about 1882 and ends in 1924 when the immigration restrictions came up. The story of those people is a story of people for whom, if you were Jewish, you were either Orthodox or you were a socialist. Those were your two options. And not a whole lot of the socialists came here, although some, ended up in these agricultural colonies. So the people who did come here were Orthodox, at least nominally. That was their Jewish practice. This rabbi that I mentioned from Burlington, Vermont, he came in the 1940s. He was a chaplain in the Second World War. He had some fascinating stories about that. But anyway, he came to Burlington and was recruited by this Jewish community in Burlington, which was mostly retailers and cattle merchants. And he almost turned down the job because he said, and this is the one guy I talked to in the whole book who was actually born in Poland. He said, this place is too much like a shtetl. I don't want to move here. They basically had to buy him off to get him to come there. And part of why he said it was too much like a shtetl, what was behind that was his sense that their religious practice was, it was nominally Orthodox, but there was no spirituality as far as he was concerned. It was lacking in passion, and it was just people doing, this isn't me, this is what he said, people just doing stuff because they were supposed to do it. He'd be walking down the street and some Jewish guy that he knew would be smoking a cigarette, and all of a sudden the guy would throw the cigarette. He didn't want to be seen smoking a cigarette. They were smoking cigarettes. In other words, there was something about their religiosity that didn't feel authentic to him. And another factor was in the movement away from Orthodoxy was, he mentions it, and many other people did as well, the separation of men and women, just made less and less sense in the context of, particularly post-war America. So there are, for many, many reasons, most of the congregations moved out of Orthodoxy into something else, whether it was Reform or conservative or what have you. That was the general trend. There's just a tiny little sidelight to this, which I'll get into. I don't know which category this falls into, but this is just the story of a fascinating particular pattern in one town. Have any of you ever been to Bethlehem, New Hampshire? Okay. So do you know, or have you figured out what's going on there? What's the Jewish take on that town?
Well, I know there's a community that lives there.
Of Hasidim, right?
Orthodox.
Yeah.
You see them walking around,
So what happened, how that evolved is that I remember seeing that about 10 years ago, and I was, what's going on? What's up with this town? So it evolved in this way. In the 20s, there were Jewish people who started to go to Bethlehem from Brooklyn primarily. These were secular Jews, or these were not particularly Orthodox Jews. These were just Jewish people who had hay fever. And Bethlehem is in the White Mountains. At least they say that it's at a higher elevation than any town east of the Mississippi. Okay, that's what I was told. And because of its high elevation, apparently people can go symptom-free. So Jewish people who suffered a lot from this hay fever started to go there. They founded a congregation. It's still there. That synagogue is still there. It's in what used to be a Methodist church. And they were going there for years and years and years. How they first started to really proliferate is an interesting story also, in that they opened up these guest houses. How that happened was that this one guy, or a few different people, but I heard it from this one person's son, somebody named Leslie Dreyer, said, well, my dad came here in the 30s, and he wanted to, spend the summer here, and there was a sign outside the hotel that said, no Jews or dogs beyond this point. And so his dad got out his checkbook, and he bought that place. And the Jews from Brooklyn bought all the places, and so for the period of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, into the 50s, many of the guest houses right on that main street in Bethlehem were owned and operated by Jews. Not Hasidim, but just Jews who had hay fever. And that's how it was presented to
The
me.
hay fever of Jews.
Then what happened was asthma medications were invented, and the Jews who were coming here started to rise economically and buy summer homes in places like the Catskills and so on, and so it kind of dissipated. This, non-Orthodox hay fever suffering Jewish community sort of dissipated, and in their place, starting around the 1970s, the Hasidim came. And so that's who you find there now, are these Hasidim who, they had some sense that there was already a Jewish presence there. And so they came, and now a few of the guest houses are owned and operated by them. The Hasidim don't even go into the Jewish temple that was founded in 1924. They have their own facilities. They have their own mikvah. They have everything that they need in their places. But that's kind of an interesting little sidelight story. Maybe we should do discussion and questions now. There's a part of the conclusion that I thought might be nice to read, but I'd like to have some interaction first, and then maybe if there's time I can read that. Yes?
Did you talk in your book about the ethnicity versus the religious aspect of the Jews in New England?
Yeah, I really couldn't get away from that. I mean, I guess it came up in the sense that the people I interviewed for the book, by definition, what makes them Jewish as far as I'm concerned is not simply that their parents happen to be Jewish, but that if I ask them, are you Jewish, they say, yes, I am. Okay, now what does that mean? For some of them it means that they participate fully in religious life, and for some of them, like this guy from the food bank farm who doesn't do any of that stuff, it just means that he identifies ethnically and culturally as Jewish. The one group of people I didn't talk to in the book are people who are Jewish but don't think of themselves as Jewish. For whom their Jewish identity is somehow, it's not part of their public identity, they repress it, they're not interested in it. Well, that wasn't a story I really wanted to pursue. So I was pursuing the stories of people who have a self-identification as Jewish, and for some people that's a religious thing, and for others it's not. And for many people, myself included, it's a convoluted thing where I'm not sure where one begins and one ends. But I don't know if that really answers your question. But yes.
What was your experience in terms of did you track population trends at all among these groups in New England? Are we losing overall Jews in these New England rural towns?
It looks like we're gaining. I think there was a loss as I mentioned, in the 50s. That's where the big loss came. And now it seems to be on the rise. I'm not really a social scientist, and so I didn't do really hard social scientific study. I looked at census figures and stuff to the extent that they were available. And there was a book that came out a couple years ago that was very useful to me, which I recommend, called Jews in Small Town America. And it's by a professor at the University of Kentucky. Now his book goes into population statistics. He's not doing ethnography, so you're not going to get the stories of people, but you get the general social pattern. And what I got from his book was this idea. He calls them triple-digit communities, towns in the United States. He's not just New England. He does California, Arkansas, Florida, Nebraska, all states of the United States. Triple-digit communities are communities where there are more than 100 Jews. And there are dozens and dozens of them all over the country. Now, the peak in those towns was probably the 1930s and 40s. And then it kind of peters out, but now it seems as though there's a rise. It's certainly, that's from the 2000 census, it looks like there's an appreciable rise.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
First of all, I think you've done a wonderful job of interweaving the interviews with the more, historical factual information and other sources. You have great bibliography in there. and I just highly recommend this book to everyone. But I was curious about when you started this book, you know, and then to the time that you finished it, what did you find that kind of surprised you, that was unexpected? I'd be interested in.
I guess what I didn't expect, I didn't quite anticipate. I thought I was going to be hearing a lot more about assimilation. I thought that was going to be a big factor. And it isn't to say that that isn't a factor, but as I mentioned in response to your question, for one thing, is I didn't really pursue that story. But it also, I think, to really answer your question, Janice, what it was that I got a sense of how integral people's Jewish identity was and is in earlier generations, and now perhaps even more so, so that given how small these populations are, the fact that people really have built their Jewish life and have built upon it and have been inspired by small town life to fortify a Jewish identity. I guess I was surprised by that, because the you know, you might think that almost seems counterintuitive. If you're one of a handful of Jewish families in a town that otherwise is happy to accept you, wouldn't it be easier to just, you know, quit being Jewish? But that doesn't seem to have been the pattern at all. In fact, it seems like quite the opposite.
Is there, a little bit related to that, is there any way to characterize levels of anti-Semitism in these communities through that time?
Well, that's a question that always comes up. And I feel, you know, first of all, I have to take a certain amount of responsibility for not having actively pursued that angle. In other words, when I did interviews, I did not ask people, can you recount to me your experiences of anti-Semitism? I had a few cases where, in contacting people by telephone ahead of time, where somebody was referred to me and I thought, you know, I'd like to interview this person. At least twice this happened, and I thought it was illustrative of something. I would say, you know, so-and-so recommended that I interview you for this project on Jewish life in small town New England. And the person would say, well, I don't think you want to talk to me. I never had any experiences of anti-Semitism. And I said, wait a minute, that's not why I called you. That's not what I'm after, you know. Having said that, where it did come out in the narratives, you know, again, to go back to this idea that I'm not a social scientist, I'm a humanist, and so really what I'm getting at are the stories and the narratives. The stories that emerge about anti-Semitism are almost always in connection with school. Kids in school being harassed, being, you know, chased or whatever. That's where it came up. And so there's a section in the book that talks, I mean, I mentioned the sign at the hotel. That's the other glaring, obvious instance of it. But I know that, I think that people have a tendency, first of all, to repress a lot of those memories. And it's not necessarily the thing you want to talk about. Where it came out was in connection with schooling. I've certainly heard, you know, there's a person that I met recently through Fitchburg State who grew up here in Greenfield, right in the Meadows area. And she's described to me terrible anti-Semitic harassment that she received, and told me that at age 9 her family left Greenfield because it was so awful. So I've heard different things, but in the book it's not really something that came up a lot.
By any chance, did you touch on the issue of perhaps how many of these people have a connection to Israel? Does the Israel issue, as far as being Jewish, is that part of their feelings about the Jewishness and the attitude of the people around them toward? They're either, you know, rabidly against Israel, like on the campuses. There's a lot of anti-Israel stuff that's fashionable now. Issue.
Right. I didn't pursue it. It came up not so much to the extent of you know, there being some major divide so much as that many of the people I talked to mentioned Israel, mentioned having visited Israel. The people who are part of this Adamah thing, so these are younger people in Connecticut doing this agricultural project. most of them studied in Israel for some period of time. There's nothing in here that speaks to any kind of anti-Zionism. If anything, it would be the opposite. But it wasn't something that I didn't really ask people to tell me what's your connection to Israel. I think it's a worthwhile question because in the sense that this book is really trying to talk about how people form a sense of connection to a place. Well, Israel is a place. Israel is the place, for many people, for many of us. And so it's kind of an interesting question. Well, if you're this attached to, Hadley, Massachusetts, does that mean that Israel is not, the promised land for you? But it's not something I ended up pursuing to any great length. Herb?
Michael, I wasn't here at the beginning, so that if you address this at the beginning, please disregard the question. How did you come to write the book?
Well, I kind of said that, but I didn't really do this part yet. So I was a grad student at UMass. That's where I got my doctoral degree, and my dissertation there was I ended up publishing it a few years later. Was on the community basically between Montague and Shutesbury along the Sawmill River. Okay, I interviewed a bunch of elderly people there because I was interested. This had no Jewish connection whatsoever, but I was interested then in narratives that convey a sense of place and that convey a sense of cultural identity around place. Most of the people I interviewed were of Yankee heritage. A few of them were of French-Canadian heritage. And I did have an interest. I was intrigued by the way in which an ethnic identity gets kind of transformed by the experience of a region. Okay, you come from Poland, or you come from Quebec, or you come from Lithuania, or you come from South Carolina. You end up in Montague, Massachusetts, for a few generations. What does it mean to become a New Englander after you've first been an Italian or a Pole or what have you? So that was in my mind when I did that book. And at a certain point after that was done, I decided, somewhat deliberately, I thought, okay, I want to continue on with this idea of ethnic identity and regional identity, but instead of just focusing on a broad assortment of people, I want to test it out with one ethnic group. And the one that came to mind, naturally, was my own ethnic group. So that's how it ended up. Nancy.
So I'm a New England Jew who grew up in Worcester and lived for 25 years in Northern California. For most of those 25 years saying, I'm New Englander. And after 25 years, moved back. So I did that in 2005, and I think it was 2002, I went on a trip to Poland and with a group of Jews from Northern California. And before I left, I knew my grandparents were from Poland, and I asked my parents about it, and they didn't know anything. My mother's side of the family, she didn't know anything about the specifics of life. But when I went to the town, I spent a day in Plotzk, where my mother's family was from. Just actually riding in the bus in Poland, I thought, this looks like New England. This looks just like New England. And when we went to Plotzk, and there were things about it that felt like Worcester. And it was like, suddenly I had an understanding of how my mother's family landed in New England, and specifically in Worcester. And it was fascinating to me, but it wasn't told to me. There was no sense of it. My parents, they said, why would you go there? But then to go and to see it and to feel the place, it was fascinating. So I just wanted to share that.
Well, I definitely, there were, I mentioned these cattle merchants, I think, and they ended up doing the same work here that they had done there. And they also, I think they gravitated here because they knew it was an agriculturally active area and so on. There were several families that represented something similar to me, that, there was something about this place that resembled where they came from. The only reason I would just be slightly hesitant to say that there's, if there's anybody in the world who wants to say that there's sort of intrinsic connection between Jews and New England, it would be me, right? But because that's my main, my main focus of study. But I'm still a little bit hesitant to say that, just because if you go to Minnesota, you're going to find Jews there. If you go to Nebraska, you're going to find Jews there. And you go to all corners of the United States, you're going to find Jewish people there. And Minnesota, I don't know how much like Poland, maybe Minnesota is, but there are all kinds of places. Jews are everywhere.
Yeah.
They're everywhere in the world. They make themselves at home all kinds of places. The project I'm working now is trying to go a little bit deeper. So to the extent that New England is what it is culturally, and I believe it is partly what it is culturally because of the Puritans,
Right.
well, is there some connection there? And that, I think, becomes very interesting, because I think
Supposed
there
to be
is.
the New
There
Jerusalem.
is and there isn't. There's both. The Puritans didn't love Jews, but they sure had a lot to say about them. They were much more interested in Jews than anybody else was. So there, I'll let you know in a few years.
You mentioned a lot of discussions you had with merchants, or those who have been merchants. Do you have many discussions with Jews who have gone into fields, medicine, law, education?
It's a blind spot in the book, frankly. I didn't do enough of that, and my wife is also often pointing out to me that I didn't talk to on a more contemporary level artists, like Nancy, for instance, because I think that's another factor. So professionals and artists and craftspeople and so on, that's a whole part of the story that I didn't, I talk a little bit about Jewish professionals in that one chapter, and a lot of what's in there is actually, it's not even talking directly to those people, it's talking to other people who said, oh yeah, all of a sudden all the Jews in the town ended up being lawyers. But I didn't really talk to I think I talked to one attorney. So I wish I'd done more. Jane?
I interviewed Norman Winston in Northampton, who was a pharmacist, and he owned a building on Main Street, and he has this incredible memory. He draws a map, and he can tell you each Jewish shopkeeper, and then he can then talk about all the dress shops that were owned by Jews, and this one was upscale, and this one was sort of this kind of clothes, and this he had it all, and he divides the whole experience between before the war and after the war. He said that the GI Bill made it possible for Jews to go. Suddenly universities were open to Jews, the professional schools were open, whereas many of them were not. So suddenly they could go to medical school. And he said there were those who left. The kids did not come back to the shops, just as you said, and very few did come back, and that was the demise of Main Street, Northampton. And his son actually became a lawyer and has his office in the building he owns on Main Street, right where the pharmacy used to be. So if you look up, you'll see, forget his first name, Winston.
Next to Thorne.
Next to Thorne's. And he's probably one of the only ones from that period who still owns a building on Main Street. Augusts do too. But then you had the 60s, as you say, the 60s and 70s. A new group of Jews came into town. Sisman, and what's the other one, the T-shirt guy, who became the new owners of property on Main Street, but not visible. They own the land, they don't own the shops.
Yeah. Yeah, you can still, you pass through towns all over the place. One of my favorite things in a town is to look at the old painted signs on the brick walls, and you can still see in a lot of towns, you see a Jewish name up there. The store is long gone, but the name is still on the wall.
I mentioned that because much of the anti-Semitism that I've grown up with, which hasn't been too intense, but where it's happened has been stereotypes about Jews and owning businesses, etc., and that may move from that to lawyers. But there's as an educator, it seems to me, for example, a large number of Jewish principals and teachers. As a principal, I've sensed that a disproportionate number of Jewish guidance counselors and psychologists, and that's in small town New England as well as in the big cities.
Yeah.
I just want to add something and ask you a question in context. The book I've just in the middle of by Ruth Gruber called Unfinished People. She makes the assertion that the reason that Jews who came here did not talk about the old country was specifically different from every other ethnic group that came here. Jews are the only people who don't talk. She has a wonderful explanation, and she finds it very important. And the title of the book is Unfinished People. The point being that people who came from the other side carried with them a kind of problem, and they didn't want to talk about it for all the understanding reasons. And they are the only ethnic group that didn't talk about it. Everybody else, if you go scratch the surface, they'll tell you about the Little Sicily. They'll talk about Greece, and they consider themselves part of that, and that's their heritage. Jews brought the food, the maybe some other things. There's another question that I have though. To what extent did you get the sense that Jews today don't talk about coming from someplace? Like when they go from here, I know there was an interesting point that you made that you come from New England. But it's my sense that with my 3 children going out now recently, what are they going to remember about living in Greenfield? Which is in other words, I grew up in New York, and I always consider myself, I still do, from the Bronx. And I'm kind of proud of it.
How is
that? Do the kids today feel centered here? Or if I took a scan of the audience and asked you about your kids, when your kids are out there in the world, do they say they're from Greenfield, or do they sort of, I'm from New England?
Well, I'm not sure. It's a good question. I think part of it is not even necessarily a Jewish story anymore as much as it is an American story, that our regional identities are kind of being washed away very quickly, and I'm not sure that the non-Jewish kids are necessarily going to have the. I don't know. It's a very good question.
Yeah, Massachusetts has a reputation around the country. You say you're from Massachusetts, it means something to people.
I'm trying to think, back on the question of. There's so many things. Remind me of the first point.
First point is Ruth Gay's point, which says, because you brought up the idea that
they don't talk
you
about
were a little
stuff.
puzzled as to that they didn't talk. And this was kind of so strongly documented in the book and identified. She distinguishes every other ethnic group anywhere, any place, any time from the Jews. But of course, because we have no home and we're driven out of everywhere, whether we acknowledge the anti-Semitism in Greenfield or not, it doesn't still exist. Are we driven out of here too? And my question is, is that true or is it not true?
Well, okay.
We talk a lot about Americanization, freedom here, the real other people. But it can be documented that the kids don't leave here. And, my daughter, my family's Canadian and American. So I think there's a better feeling towards Canada, frankly. And it's really profoundly there.
I'm going to just read you very quickly on the question of the old country and remembering it and so on. I quoted a sentence from Philip Roth on that exact subject. I think he puts it very well. This is from the book of his that just came out a few years ago, The Plot Against America. He says, though Ireland still mattered to the Irish, and Poland to the Poles, and Italy to the Italians, we retained no allegiance, sentimental or otherwise, to those old world countries we had never been welcome in and that we had no intention of ever returning to. And I think that says a lot. The other point of interest on this whole question of connections to places and so on is, and this is, I guess, a trend within not just New England, but the United States and maybe broader than that, is that I think there's something in Jews that, in the Jewish experience, that speaks towards a view of the future, a view of possibility. And where a lot of people in various American ethnic groups have that connection to an old place that they came from. For Jews, there's a tradition, obviously, there's a precious tradition, but the actual circumstances of life, the assumption is they're going to get better, and let's start the story where we are right now. And there's a connection for me in the story of New England to that, because while we think on a certain level, we think of New England as the oldest part of the United States, and this treasure trove of heritage and antiquity and so on, and there's a certain truth to that. New England, I think, also is distinct from the rest of the country in that, notwithstanding that connection to the past, it's also always been a very forward-thinking region of the United States. If you think of all the major progressive political movements in the United States, they pretty much all started here. The Revolution, abolitionism, gay marriage, for that matter. So much of it starts here. So this region of the country, for me anyway, combines a real high regard for history and at the same time a tendency, I think that's what, for me anyway, that's what Yankee culture is all about, is also a sense of possibility, technological change, and so on. I mean, New Englanders were famous throughout America in the 19th century for being the people who invented stuff, And so I think there's a tie-in there with Jews as well, who, as a people, I think we realize there's nothing to be gained. We don't want to go back to the past. There's nothing that exciting and glorifying that we're going to find in those old places we came from. We're much better off living in the modern world. I think for Jews, the modern world is probably a more comfortable place than it is for a lot of other people. That's by necessity, but it also, I think, speaks well of Judaism and the Jewish tradition in terms of its adaptability. That's how you get through life, I think, is by embracing what's coming down as opposed to trying to return to what you can't have and never had in the first place.
I just want to address what Mike said about kids, do they come back? And I know our kids, and we'll see a lot of other children of the community members that, when Christian kids come home, they come home for the Christmas holidays. A lot of the Jewish kids come home on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and they'll come to services. And they love to come back to the community and to participate in the service, where a lot of them don't have their own communities where they live. Young kids don't join communities that early in life, and until they do, they all want to come home and be with their parents and come to services. And I know that my daughter has a group of her friends who grew up in Greenfield, and every year will come back for the fair. They won't miss the fair. And the Greenfield Fair isn't a great fair.
That's when I'd leave.
Yeah. They come back because they want to go to the Greenfield Fair. So it is. Huh?
I'm a New York boy who never went to a fair. I won't miss the fair. Everybody there. I don't care.
People do come back. Kids do come back.
One of just a kind of fun story about the high holidays and synagogue attendance. This is back to that Adelman family. I interviewed Milt, who's the guy in his 80s, and his son and one of his daughters. And the son and daughter, who are about my age, maybe a little bit, late 40s, early 50s, were telling me that they had a particular love for the high holidays. This was in Mars Hill. And that was because the high holidays came at the height of the potato harvest, and it meant that they had a couple days off from being out in the fields. And I thought, these are the only kids in the world whose associations with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are that they don't have to pick potatoes in a field.
I just want to make a comment on Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem that you opened up with, and the impression I got, a little bit different from what you said, is with his ending there about when he says, what happened to these people? I got, he was asking, what happened to the Hebrew nation? And being in the mid-1800s, it gave me a different perspective how people looked at Jews back then, because there was no Israel. There was no Hebrew nation. And I felt like he was saying, what happened to the Hebrew nation? I found it encouraging to think how he looked at it then, and 100 years later, little beknownst to him, the Hebrew nation rose again and formed the state of Israel.
Yeah.
Okay, my name's Louis Becker,
I live in Leiden. Let's see, my father was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My mother was born in Chelsea, Massachusetts. My childhood background was from Dorchester, Massachusetts. One thing that I'm looking forward to reading your book, Michael.
Wait.
Okay,
This is going to be
just-
too long.
I have one
Let's
more
move
thing.
faster.
I have one more thing.
One more thing.
Here, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I think a big influence as far as people in my generation that live in this part of Massachusetts is the University of Massachusetts. I don't know if that's been mentioned. Was that brief enough?
What did your father do for a living, or your mother?
My father was a printer.
Okay. Next.
We're going this way. I'm Robin Stolman. I'm a member here at Temple Israel. And I've lived in Massachusetts for more than 20 years, but still consider myself a New Yorker, as you said. And both my parents are from the Bronx. Although my dad went to high school in Long Island City, he still thinks of himself as from the Bronx. And my dad worked with my grandfather in restaurants, and my mom works for Social Security.
My name is Alicia Walter, and I've been living in Massachusetts for about 15 years. I grew up in New Milford, New Jersey. My parents are both from Paterson, New Jersey, and my father was a podiatrist. And although, you know, my father wasn't from Paterson, my father, I believe he was born in Brooklyn and came to Paterson much later on in his life and kind of considers himself between two worlds there.
My name is Nancy Katz. I live in Shelburne Falls, Buckland, and I, after living in California for 25 years, but I grew up in Worcester. Both of my parents were born in Worcester. Their parents are from Poland and Russia.
I'm Daniel Yalowitz. I've been living here in Greenfield for about 2 years, but I'm a born and bred New Yorker and a proud and unapologizing Yankee fan. And my father grew up in the Bronx in New York, and my mother in Brooklyn. Their parents are from Russia and Romania. They're both social workers, and I moved to Massachusetts at the age of 18, went to college, did all my schooling here, and have been here for about 35 years.
My name's Margie Sobel. I grew up in Lawrence. My dad grew up in Lawrence. My mom was from Boston. Interestingly, my grandfather was a printer in Dorchester, and my father's father was in retail.
My name is Janice Colbert, and I have been in Greenfield since 1980. I grew up in Queens, New York. My mother, who's here today, will tell you about her background. My father was an accountant. My mother was a dietitian and a teacher, and grew up also in New York, New Jersey.
I'm Peter Garvis, lived in Greenfield for a little over a year. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, where my mom was from, and my dad was from Hartford, Connecticut. Dad was a lawyer, and my mom was an interior decorator.
My name is Karen Taylor. I've been in Greenfield since 1987. My mother was from North Adams. My father was from Granville, New York. I grew up in North Adams living with my grandparents. My father was in retail, and my mother sold advertising.
I'm David Taylor. I grew up in Randolph on the South Shore of Boston. My parents came from Mattapan, part of Boston, and my previous generation, my grandparents came from Lithuania and the Volhynia province of the Ukraine. My father was a engineer, and I think my grandfather was an upholsterer when he came to this country. My other grandfather was I think he was a peddler and like a milkman, and went through various jobs.
I'm Jen Sims. I grew up pretty much in Greenfield, was born in Nebraska when my father was in art school. My father was born in Brooklyn, raised in Wayne, New Jersey, and moved to Greenfield, and his profession has mostly been in real estate and construction.
I'm Archie Neyman. I was born in Island Roads, which was then in Italy, part of Italy. My parents are from Turkey. I lived the first 20 years of my life in Africa, where my father worked in the copper mines in northern Rhodesia. I lived in Israel for 3 years prior to coming to America, where I was a machinist, and I'm retired right now.
I'm Yessel Kurland. Live in Coleraine. Have been living in rural western Massachusetts since about 1975, 76. Grew up in the Bronx. My parents also grew up in New York City, and my grandparents came from Berditchev, another town in Poland, which I can't remember, I forget exactly, Stuchin, and Minsko-Gubelnia.
I'm Mark Platt. I'm a retired physician. Been here with my wife and 3 children since 1992. I grew up in New York City. My parents came from Poland, and they were on the last boat out from the Holocaust. My father and my mother came out 3 months before that, and they came from 2 cities. One was Lvov and Malkin. My father was a tailor, and my mother was a wannabe actress. In life, the 3 children became professionals due to the success, I guess, of my father's business in clothing in New York City. He was also a prominent Yiddishist in New York and helped support Jewish life throughout the region. My siblings have spread out to the Jewish sites that I consider Jewish sites in the United States along the East Coast. One is in Washington, D.C., and the other stayed in New York City. And my children have followed a similar pattern. One is in Boston, and one is in Washington, and one is in New York City. That's it.
My name's Emily Kester. I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, and came to the Pioneer Valley in about 1990. I live in Northfield right now. My parents were both from Brooklyn, New York, and my dad was a college professor and my mom was an early childhood teacher.
I'm Ken Schoen. I live in South Deerfield. I've been in the valley since about '83. My parents came from Germany, my mother in 1935, my father in 1927. They both came from small villages, and they both were cattle dealers. And my father was a coffee salesman, had a coffee business, and I became a merchant also.
Don't be a vermiddle.
Thank you.
I'm Florence Klein. I originally came from Brooklyn, and I'm only here about 3 months, so I'm kind of disappointed that there are most of the people in Millhouse where I'm staying, because my daughter lives in Massachusetts, and I miss my old home because I'm here. I lived in it 55 years. My father was an architect, and I'm a retired social worker, social worker, and I was hoping that there'd be more people. Everyone is from Millhouse. Most of the people are from Orange or towns around, and I'm looking for some people who are in Rockland County, which is 20 miles north of the George Washington Bridge. And yeah,
you miss the New Yorkers.
Yeah, so
well, there's few in the room.
Yeah, but so I'm hoping to make some identity here, and I draw and paint now.
I'm Michael Hurwitz. I was born in Long Island, but I've lived in a bunch of different cities. I moved to Greenfield in 1983. My parents were both born and grew up in Boston. My father's parents came from Poland. My mother's parents from England, although her father was born in Odessa or in that area. And my father's father was a house painter, and his mother was a seamstress. You know, my mother's father was a labor lawyer. Let's see, my father was a university professor, my mother was a high school teacher.
My name is Shirley Glenn. I'm proud to be the mother of Janice, and I was brought up in a small town in New Jersey called South River, and both of my parents were born in New York, and they were storekeepers in New Jersey. And I have to comment about the small towns such as South River, New Jersey, where all of the storekeepers seem to be Jewish. And a lot of the community were very close-knit. Everybody belonged to the synagogue, and my mother was very active in the synagogue and so forth.
Do you know where your parents came from?
They both were born in New York.
But their
Their parents.
Minsk were born there, that's where.
Well, yes, my grandmother was from Minsk, and she was very religious. I can only remember her holding the Bible and reading from it.
Do we start with names?
Yes.
Okay, Michael Hoberman. I live in Shelburne Falls, and I've lived in Western Massachusetts since 1987 when I came to UMass. Lou's point is well taken. I grew up in New York City mostly. My mother was born in Israel, except it wasn't Israel yet when she was born. She was born in a kibbutz, which is still there. Her family is still on the kibbutz. It's called Kibbutz Hefzibah. And her parents came to the kibbutz in the 20s from, her father came from Austria. He served in the Kaiser's army in World War I, and her mother came from Czechoslovakia. My father was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut. His parents had come from Russia, and his father, I know his father came, before he came to Bridgeport, came to Haverhill, Mass. So my New England connection is, the earliest New England connection is somewhere in the 1880s or 90s. This grandfather worked in a shoe factory in Haverhill and then went to Bridgeport from there. That's my story.
How'd they meet your parents?
My parents, my father was a research biochemist at the Albert Einstein Medical School in the Bronx, and he was on sabbatical at the Weizmann Institute in Israel, and my mother was a secretary there, and this dashing young divorcee in visiting Israel in the early 60s.
Jeff Plotkin. My grandfather Isidore came in the early 1900s as a boy from Russia. I think it was Osipovich, which might be part of Russia, part of Poland, switched hands many times. He was a rag peddler, and he did well enough going to the different farms, a small rural community, sometimes he slept in barns, to start a furniture business in Athol. And I am now third generation still in that business. One of the few merchants in the Athol Orange area to have a business. There were, as alluded, many merchants in Athol and Orange who had shops.
My name is Avery Plotkin. I was born in Worcester and lived my formative years in Worcester until I married, moved to Athol in 1946. My grandfather came from Germany. He moved to London where he met my grandmother, and that's where my mother was born. My dad was born in Białystok in Poland, was a tailor, but he eventually became a coat manufacturer in Worcester. And after living in Orange for many years, my husband became ill, and he became a resident of the Buckley Nursing Home, which prompted my moving to Greenfield. And I always say that's one of the best decisions I ever made. I really like living here.
Hi, my name is Mitchell Grosky. My family and I moved to Athol almost 30 years ago. I'm a retired principal and teacher and professional photographer, and my wife is a teacher. And my parents came from Brooklyn, New York, where my dad was a photographer, my mom was a secretary, and their parents came from Russia, where our name I think was Gorhovsky, and shortened to Grosky as we came over, and also from Austria. And both of my children are in college now, but I grew up in my formative years. After spending 4 years in Brooklyn, we moved to Haverhill, Massachusetts, and so that's where I grew up until going to college up in Lewiston, Maine at Bates. Nice Jewish community up there too.
My name is Arthur Victor. My father shortened it to Victor from Vidorovich. He was born in Minsk. My mother was born in Vilna. They came to this country in the early 1900s. I was born in Springfield, but grew up mostly in Pennsylvania, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where Joe Biden is from. I moved to New England to go to college and never left, and mostly in the Boston area, and worked in human services. I now live in Turner's Falls. I've been there about 8 years because the rents are low. I can't afford to live in the Boston area anymore. And I guess that's it.
The person I didn't get was...
You.
I'm Jane Trigere, and what happened? I dropped?
You're a half Jane Trichere.
Okay. I'm Jane Trigere, and I moved up here to live with my husband, Ken Schoen. Well, he became my husband. And to me, this is the strangest place I've ever lived. My family is all from big cities. My father is born in Odessa and moved as a child to Paris, and not going any place. They then moved in 1937 to New York City. And so my experience is always big cities, and we lived in Buenos Aires also. So perhaps stranger yet was when I moved to Israel, where I lived for 10 years, and I lived on a kibbutz for 6 years. I was a chaverat meshek, I was a member of a kibbutz, and that's what made moving to South Deerfield, Massachusetts possible. Because when I was out there milking the cows at 4 in the morning, I realized I was a long way from my hometown of Manhattan, and I could live anywhere. So that's why I'm here in New England. Although I did spend 11 years in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That was my other town.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all for coming, and like I said, Michael will be here for a little bit longer.